So we're recording. Now I'm going to do live on Facebook. This will just take me a minute to okay, one moment. Okay, I'm about to press go. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first reading in JMU, James Madison University, for those of you who are not a part of our community. Our creative writing program spring reading series. My name is Erica Kavanaugh. I chair the creative writing program at James Madison University. Tonight's readers who are here with me right now, at least on this screen, are Samar Fitzgerald and Thomas Martin. Before I introduce them and we launch into their readings, I want to thank Maddie Tucker for the flyers for this reading and for her social media savvy, and Angela Carter for helping to advertise the event. I also want to thank my wingman, who is off somewhere and is going to text me if anything goes wrong technologically with tonight's reading, and that is Brant Jones. Thank you, Brant. For tonight's reading, Samar Fitzgerald will read first, then Thomas Martin, followed by a Q&A session. So if questions come up for you that you want to pose to our readers, please type them into the little Q&A button icon, whatever you want to call it, at the bottom of your screen. And we will get to as many of those as we can at the end of the reading. Okay, so first, Samar Fitzgerald will read. Samar Fitzgerald's fiction has appeared in places such as the O. Henry Prize Stories, New England Review, the Southern Review, Witness, and Southwest Review. She has received fellowships and awards from the MacDowell Colony, the Ragdale Foundation, the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and the Virginia Commission for the Arts. She lives in Staunton with her husband and 2 children and teaches creative writing at James Madison University. And here's where I'll disappear and give it over to Samar.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this reading series. Thank you to the Creative Writing Program and the JMU English Department for supporting the event. And of course, thank you to all of you for being here tonight. A special shout out to any students of mine, current and former, who are here. Thank you so much for taking the time out. I'm going to read a selection from the novel I've been working on for several years. I won't say how many years I've been working on it. And before I begin, I think it might be useful if you know a few things about the story. It might help you follow along. So the main character is Nina Bitar. She's 30 years old and she's a second generation Lebanese American. Her parents immigrated around the late 70s to New Jersey and raised their children there. And then when Nina was around 25 years old, her parents repatriated back to Lebanon. The other thing you should know is that Nina is speaking for much of the novel. She is speaking to a man named Will. He's a former coworker and they used to be intimate. He is a photographer and she's I'm sorry, I messed that up. He's a journalist and she's a photographer. And this informs some of the ways that they disagree with each other. And as you'll see you'll get an inkling of that in the excerpt I'm about to read. So I'm going to read the beginning of the novel, then I'll jump ahead a little bit, not too far ahead, and read another short excerpt. The novel is called The End of Conversation. When I was little, someone from Lebanon had a habit of calling very early. The sound of the phone ringing in our dark house would wake me. My father was the one who got up and shuffled to the kitchen, where he flipped on the light. From my bedroom, I could hear him shouting, "Allo, allo, nihna mneh, kil shi mneh." I turn over in the sheets and face the hallway. That's where this memory really begins, with light that pulled me into someone else's conversation and gave shape to my things, the pencils on my desk and the miniature perfume bottles I like to collect. I could have wandered into the kitchen so my father would realize I was awake and lower his voice, but I didn't. I stayed in bed and waited for the end of the call. It never lasted more than a few minutes. "Kilna mneh, kil shi mneh." Everybody's good. Everything is good, he'd be saying. And sometimes, "The boy is a young man now. His sister likes school. It snowed yesterday. The peaches here are tasteless. Everything is good. Yes, yes, mneh." Except Saul doesn't remember these phone calls, even though his bedroom was across the hall. So I could be exaggerating how loud my father was, and who knows, I might be wrong about what he said. My Arabic was never that great. Maybe he wasn't even yelling. Maybe that's just how Arabic has always sounded to my ears, a little angry, like distant gunfire. Is that even true? Or is it you speaking, Will? The kind of thing you would say, and therefore the kind of thing I imagine saying to you now, more than 5 years later. It embarrasses me, actually, how I picked my words around you. That time I called my ice cream cone an obscenity because, on a whim, I asked for the rainbow sprinkles, after which you took pleasure in calling everything obscene, like my neighbor's fat dog. That wasn't really me, but me with you. It's never been in my nature to think that much about language. And as you can see, this isn't exactly a story. I waited for the conversation to end, and later, as the day took over, no one mentioned the phone call, and I thought no more of it than one might think of a small disturbance. So I highly doubt, this is the kind of thing you had in mind when you asked so soon after we met, "What is your family like?" It's true, though, for a long time when I thought about those calls, if I thought about them, I thought about light traveling down the hallway into my bedroom. And by thought about, I mean, of course, pictured the way the light touched my bureau and made my perfume bottles glow. A particular mood I can't describe very well, but tell myself I could paint it now if I needed to. For years, that was the extent of the memory, all of it, or as you might say, the beginning, middle, and end. By the way, I saw your recent article in the Globe and Mail about female pop stars in the Middle East. I read the whole thing, and before I even finished, my thought was, I bet he enjoyed himself. I'm referring, of course, to that singer on the Jump page with light green eyes and freckles. On the fair side, assuming your taste hasn't changed, but still managing to possess all that mystery, well, what else to call it? You were always after. But seriously, these days you get around Cairo, Damascus, Kabul, Beirut at least once or twice every couple months, it seems. According to the internet, you live in Istanbul. I imagine you in a 2-bedroom with tall windows, a small practical kitchen, out of date, but appealing in its own way. Perhaps those speckled floor tiles common in that part of the world, or a view of the water, which, if we still knew each other, you would quickly dismiss as easy to come by, not as expensive as one might think, etc. So guess what? I just got back from Lebanon. The second leg was canceled, and from the moment my father dropped me off at the airport until I turned the key in my apartment in Boston, 2 days passed. Almost 48 hours of flying and airport time, and I never checked into a hotel. Impressed? Well, at some point I finished the magazines I'd packed, and out of boredom in Heathrow, I bought the paper, and that's when I read your article. And because I had not seen your byline in months, though I admit there was a time when I looked for it every week, and because you were always pushing me to visit my parents and so interested in the Lebanese stuff, the whole thing seemed like more than a coincidence. For days, I've been walking around the South End, sorting out how I would respond now to all those questions you had back then. This morning, I went to the bakery we liked, and a teenage boy I'd never seen before told me they have a new location on the other side of the river. Still, the one on Washington was more crowded than ever. At least the man who used to ring us up at the corner market. Can you picture him? You said his smile was smeared on, recognized me, and wanted to know where I'd gone. For 2-3 weeks, I saved your papers, he said, but you never came. Where did you go? I didn't entirely mind him getting worked up like that. If I were to tell you, he looked at me with concern when I pulled my library card out of my wallet and handed it to him. Would you feel even a twinge of worry? Would you? By the way, it was fine, the article. It was. Except, did you really mean that part about the singers being far from the Middle Eastern ideal of the demure female? It made me think of that time we were walking down Columbus, trying to decide on a place for dinner, this other couple not so far ahead of us. They must have been coming from Dunkin' Donuts, but they were both dressed in shimmery black clothes. My guess is they were speaking Persian, or is it Farsi? But to an average American, which is what I considered you then, it probably sounded a lot like Arabic. Well, something about him both amused and offended you even before he did what he did, his strong cologne and tight pants, plus the fact that he was the only one talking. Or maybe it was just the general impression he made. Not someone you and I would hang out with, Will, but the truth is, for all your compassion and your talent for sniffing out prejudice, for all that talked up liberalism, you could be a snob. When he crumpled up the donut bag and threw it against the side of a building, I could nearly taste your satisfaction, even as you shook your head. And the girl he was with must have sensed something too. Right then, she turned and smiled at you, a smile that was more of an apology, which clearly did not escape you because later you circled back to it. You know who I really feel sorry for, that girl. Then you asked me if I thought their marriage had been arranged, presumably because he looked so much older. When I suggested they were only dating, you called him, what was the word you used? A lout? Is that it? Your palms open, judgment smeared all over your face. But really, what was left to contribute at that point? As if she was the first girl in the history of mankind to fall for such a guy? I'm not defending him either, but he hardly deserved more attention than any other jerk. But forget all that and forget the article. I'm not myself. And I don't mean jet lagged and tired. That was my problem, wasn't it? Most of the time I was a poor match for your energy, a disappointment when it came to the natural range and depth of my curiosity about, about everything, including, I suppose, my own family. But now, it crossed my mind when I was hanging out in Beirut these past months, there was an outside chance I might run into you. They blew up a politician's car, and I thought maybe it would be the sort of thing that would bring Will here. As it turned out, I was in Lebanon 11 months, much longer than the 10 days I planned on. Saul hardly stayed a week. He had to get back to Madison for his oral exams, and we all agreed it wouldn't have made sense for him to throw away more than 4 years worth of work. Of course, it wasn't a trip either of us had been prepared to make. I wonder, if I had run into you at the airport or on some street in Beirut, would I have felt comfortable telling you? Or should I say, would you have had enough grace to smile and ask how I'm doing? Will, my mother died. What was I getting at though? I was trying to say I've been remembering more. And I see how remembering can be like wandering around familiar but empty streets at night. That's not exactly what you said, but wasn't it something to that effect? At the time, I thought you meant that remembering was another kind of seeing, browsing with our mind's eye. But lately, and by lately, I suppose I mean since my mother's death, I wonder if I hadn't fully appreciated the wandering part of what you said, how easy it is to get lost remembering. If I think about those phone calls now, the ones that woke me up, I find myself wanting to go on, to wander. There are things about my old bedroom I thought I'd forgotten. Those sample-sized bottles of designer perfume on my bureau, they came 5 or 6 to a long cardboard box that my uncle, Saul and I always called him Ammu Ziad, would magically pull out of his suitcase, along with a thin stack of letters from my mother in the foreign envelopes with blue and red striped borders, which I never got to read. And I'm just this second recalling a giant Toblerone for Saul. Or like the gold and copper like the gold and copper wallpaper that stayed in my room until I was in middle school, when my parents tore down the house to build another one in its place. I hadn't thought about the wallpaper for a long time. Then I saw it again a couple years ago in an old photograph. I'm sitting on my bed next to my brother, each of us holding an Easter basket. The wallpaper is behind us, and it has two repeating images, a tropical bird and a palm tree. The branches become tails, which become branches again. The artist's hand is very precise, obsessive. I don't think I ever loved it, but even as a child, I admired it. And if you were close enough, you could see the individual strokes that made the ends of the tail feathers that were also the shape of so many leaves. And I'm thinking, what was a tropical scene doing in that Cape Cod house in New Jersey anyway? Then my mind goes to the real palm trees in Beirut, which shouldn't have surprised me at all, but they did. As much as it surprised you when I told you that besides my own name, I couldn't read a word of Arabic. Even after my parents returned to Beirut, Ziad, he's just Ziad now, continued to bring me things from Lebanon. The za'atar you like so much, the enormous evil eye amulet. He brought me that Easter picture, hand-delivered it in one of those envelopes that used to contain letters addressed to my mother. I took it out today for the first time in years and turned it over right away, hoping my mother had written a message. There's only the notes she'd made when it was taken, the year, 1983, and the holiday. I stared at the script, and her familiar handwriting struck me for the first time as playful and unshy. Then I thought of your theory about handwriting and that my mother must be the exception, or you actually can't tell much about a person from their handwriting, unless, of course, my mother was playful and unshy and never let us see. A few weeks after the funeral, over a couple sandwiches, my father wanted to tell me about her. I learned that she had kept many things from me and Saul. They both had kept from us, beginning with the fact that she wasn't an only child. My mother once had a sister who had been in medical school in Beirut with my father. One day, after fighting in Lebanon had been going on for months, the two sisters drove into the city. They were stopped at a checkpoint and, as my father put it, only your mother came back alive. A few months later, my parents were on a plane to the US. Sometimes I think of it this way. Each day she was my mother, I walked through the same door where the same woman lived and worked. But if I had opened another door, a different door, I would have found someone else. When I said wandering just now, you probably imagined a friendly meandering. But as you can see, there's a bit more to it than that. Say that I had run into you on some street in Beirut, or that while I was waiting to board for Heathrow, I called your name, and the tallish, fair-skinned man buying nuts at the duty-free counter turned out to be you. Say we found a place to sit in some corner of the boarding gate, and in your fashion, you teased me about finally making a trip to see my parents. So I told you that I was only there because my mother had died. I know how your face would fall. I saw it when an interview turned personal, your way of leaning in and lowering your lids, making yourself smaller than you are. A sympathy so well executed, one feels instantly indebted. Your sympathy, my gratitude and debt. It's easy to imagine our conversation would naturally end right there. But for once, I'd be the one with more questions to ask. Like, I wonder what would stun you more, the things my mother endured and never mentioned to her children, my parents' coordinated secrecy, or my complete surprise. Everybody has a story, you shrugged once after an interview went improbably well. And although I told myself I didn't agree, I felt this old insecurity passing through me. In my defense, though, what sort of answer could I have constructed for you out of the information they'd given me? Everyone is good. Everything is good. Either my parents were brilliant magicians, or there were distress signals firing in that house all those years, and I was just too complacent or too focused on my own survival. But what child isn't to notice? I never knew anyone as solicitous, as inquisitive as you, or as determined to settle a question. So that makes you both the first and the last person I want to talk to right now about my mother and my family and everything else. Lebanon, what it's like to be in Boston again, the photography I've been up to recently. At least this isn't a letter. The short answer to your question could be, we're not a letter writing type of family. perhaps a brief phone call type of family, to confirm basic safety and general good health. Kildamneh, kilshimneh. No, this is more of a one-sided conversation that will eventually have to wear itself out. And I'm just going to skip ahead here and read just a couple more pages. I'm not jumping too far ahead. This is still within the first 50 pages of the book. Do you remember my mother, Will? I mean, do you remember meeting her on the street near my apartment? That brief, awkward moment, all three of us were standing together. It was only a few days after you and I met, covering the story about the Cambridge shop owner who couldn't afford the rent anymore. I still don't know what brought you to the South End that afternoon, but given our first assignment together, it shouldn't have surprised me that you recognized me before I recognized you. Your mother, you tossed out a bit presumptuously. Never mind that you were in my neighborhood. Later, you called her a tragic movie star. Apparently, even her name, Amal, struck a glamorous note in your ear, and I listened, impatient and perplexed, until you moved on. You had no idea I could be jealous of my mother, and you probably assumed I was rolling my eyes because you'd reached for a lousy cliche. Not so much a movie star, you eventually revised, but tragic. There's a tragic air about her. What was it precisely that made you say that? Real intuition or plain habit? This extra sense, useful on the job, turning into a compulsion. I'm not saying you want to see tragedy everywhere. Regardless, I had never before considered my mother in this light. Easily, out of habit, I see her as a charcoal drawing on paper, her lips too well centered on a blank face, perhaps an unshaded forehead running off the top edge of the paper, brooding, moody, but not at all tragic, a little Modigliani, except more abstract. I'm speaking to you now in my most familiar language. Sometime in my early teens, I discovered a portrait painter who always left out one eye. He thought you could get a more honest representation of a face that way. An idea I ran toward back then as though it were safe shelter. In this charcoal of my mother, there's only her mouth, a nearly oval shape, and her prominent forehead, maybe a tiny smudge to indicate the faint puckering of her chin. The mouth is colored solid without shading, making it the focus, what your eyes go to first, because that's how it was if she was standing in front of you. My most familiar language, but at the same time, what good are words to describe lines? This is how I preferred to think of things for so long, and still do largely because I want to believe my present state of mind will eventually pass, and because I never like to think of myself as sentimental. And often it seemed that mostly sentimental ideas come from talking about pictures. What I failed to realize before is how death renders a photograph incomplete, how insufficient or irrelevant artistry feels when one is simply looking for information. My mother left behind so little: her wardrobe, a couple of art objects, a handful of photographs from her youth, but not many at all, and all of them managing to guard her secrets. I don't possess a single letter or email from her. In my earliest memory of my mother, I am 2 or 3 and kneeling on her lap, tracing her mouth with my finger. The memory is so gauzy, it's probably a memory of a dream. Her head is tipped back against the headrest on her chair, and her eyes on the chair, and her eyes are closed, but she's not sleeping, just showing me how tired she is. With my thumb and forefinger, I press her bottom and top lips together, sealing a tiny gap that's always been there because she never had braces. I expect her to reach up in irritation to grab at my hand at any moment, but she lets me go on pinching long enough that a funny sensation comes over me. It's as though I'm playing with a doll. Frightened, I shout for her, and she opens her eyes and smiles calmly. Perhaps she utters some comfort. I'm here, Mina. Relax, Mina. Like the phone calls, this is less of a story and more of a picture, an image I carried around forever until she died, and now, reasonably or unreasonably, it's taken on the significance of a hieroglyph. The shape of her mouth pesters me. It's here and there on a billboard face, the curve of a piece of fruit, and I miss my old self, which was content merely to think my mother's lips were her lips. They belonged to her, and what belonged to me was my eye on her lips and nothing else. I must have accompanied my mother to the supermarket often as a child, for I can also close my eyes and see her without much effort in the produce section, testing one onion, then 2, quickly, then quickly, indiscriminately filling the rest of her bag. I'm watching with my chin resting on the handle of the shopping cart, resentful for having to be there at all, and taking in the fact that from a distance, my mother appears petite, conservative about her dress, her comportment. I say conservative and not shy. Her expression at rest was, more than anything, aloof. It didn't matter. Everywhere we went, there were eyes on her. Strangers complimented her hair, her smile. As a child, I assumed they found her more different than beautiful. Where are you from? They usually came around to asking, or sometimes they didn't ask but guessed, looking back and forth between her and her children as though our faces were a question on a quiz show. But maybe what they actually saw was the same thing you saw, whatever led you to say tragic seeming. But what was that precisely? What combination of lines and shadow equal tragic? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Summer. That was such a rich, multi-layered reading in so many different geographical places there too. Really beautiful. We're going to shift to Thomas Martin now. I'm going to introduce him and then he'll read for us. So Thomas Martin was raised in the Eastern United States and Central America. He completed his Ph.D. in English at Western Michigan University and now teaches literature and fiction writing at James Madison University. Excerpts from his novel, Guatemalan Elegy, have been published in Flyway and Passages North. And I turn it over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this reading. And thanks to those of you who took the time to be in the audience. So this is another excerpt from my first novel, Guatemalan Elegy, that I'm about to read. It's not one of the published ones that you were just mentioning, Erica. So this is an excerpt from the third chapter of Guatemalan Elegy. Henry Foster peered at the clock on the mantel. 6:30, he said, feels like midnight. Neither his parents nor his brother responded. His family members had been going over that morning's incidents throughout the afternoon, and now the sky was dark. That morning, 17-year-old Henry had been bringing his 9-year-old brother Jason home from La Aurora International Airport when their bus was stopped at a roadside inspection on a cliff that overlooked Lake Atitlan, a body of fresh water skirted by mountains and volcanoes in the Sierra Madres. When he tried to bribe a soldier, Henry got beaten up. Afterward, he led his brother off the bus to avoid further inspections. They hiked through cornfields down to the northern shore, found a dugout, and paddled across the lake. But before they reached their cove, a downpour sank the dugout with their luggage, which included research books for their father. They swam the last 50 yards. Henry gazed into the fireplace as the chimney hummed in breezes whistling up the lawn from the lake. The murmuring in the pines soothed him, and he loved watching the slow drama of the burning logs. Bottle-shaped flames crackled against blackened rocks. When a knot exploded, sparks dotted the hearth, faded from orange to gray, and sent up threads of smoke, one flattening into a ribbon that twisted and broke into ripples. The screen guard had been folded and set aside. He was getting up from the bamboo frame couch when his mother kneeled beside his armrest. "Where do you think you're going?" she said. "Just putting back the screen. Let it be," his father said. He had fractured his tibia and lost his prescription glasses while hiking, and he squinted over the round coffee table from his wicker chair beside the fire. In a cast, his right ankle rested upon the table. Henry mused upon the fire. He had picked up new glasses for his father, but the soldier at the inspection had crushed them. Flames issued from smoldering nuggets of pine, ashes drifting up the flue. Under the logs, the cross-hatched kindling was dissolving into a web of limp gray tubes. Even the long-lasting chunk of oak seemed about to collapse. When he turned toward his mother, he saw miniature reflections of his own face curved across the dampness of her eyeballs. The different levels of his reflections, his chin, his nose, and his gauze-wrapped head, were squashed as flat as tortillas and stacked on top of each other. Her eyes mirrored the fireplace too, which made his scalp appear to be on fire. A gust blustered against the side of the house facing the cove, making the screen door squeak while swinging inward on reversible hinges. The fire brightened, and the scent of damp aloe vera blossoms swirled into the living room. When the storm had passed over the caldera hours ago, the rain soaked the landscape terraces between the house and cove. He smelled night crawlers under the sod and wished he could spend tomorrow fishing instead of being at school. His left ear throbbed. "Mom, can I have another codeine before bed?" "Just leave the bottle in the medicine cabinet," his father told his mother. "Codeine is a morphine-based opiate," she said. "Thanks for the information." His father aped a yawn. Hair stuck out from his collar and merged with his beard. He had stopped shaving at the start of his year-long sabbatical from Johns Hopkins University. The books on the table included a facsimile of a Mayan codex, a hieroglyphic book made of pounded bark paper coated with a plaster wash, the paper folded and covered within fake jaguar fur, and a volume called Orientalism that his father had bought before leaving Maryland. Two long-stemmed glasses flanked a bottle of red wine, their second. His ankle rested beside a clamshell serving as an ashtray. "Maybe you guys should stay home tomorrow," their mother said. Tamale and tamale and tamale. Their father sipped from his glass of Cabernet Sauvignon. In the firelight, his wine sparkled. "I do need to practice my violin scales," Jason said. "You guys are going to school tomorrow," their father said. He raised his glass. He had toasted Jason during their first bottle. 2-hour Ubermensch with all his awards, commendations, and honors. He beamed at Jason, who had just returned from an awards ceremony in Miami, where he won another prize for his work with the violin. "Yes, we're both very proud of you." His mother craned her neck. Henry flattened his shoulders against the cushions so that she and Jason could exchange blissed out smiles across the couch. His mother went back to clearing the dinner table, normally Henry's job. The table was built from a 6-inch thick cross-section of 2 tree trunks, ash trees, his father told him, that had fused together in growth. Shaped like a figure 8, the tabletop gleamed under the crystal prisms of the cut glass chandelier. After Henry and his brother had shown up, drenched and rattled, their mother started wigging out. Their father had smoothed her feathers by firing up a fat spliff. Henry could feel molecules of marijuana clinging to what his father called his olfactory receptors. His contact high lingered, livening up his codeine buzz. When he turned 18, he would be allowed to smoke. Now his mother seemed in danger of getting all shook up again. He flung a worried glance to his father. "Sorry we lost your books." Jason turned. "Not we." "What?" Henry was spacing out. You lost the books and glasses. Why lay a guilt trip on your brother? Their father said. The whole thing was my fault. He added that he probably shouldn't have gone hiking on Volcano Toliman just before his planned drive to Guatemala City. Assault rifles, his mother said. Rebel, guerrillas. Henry tightened the belt of his bathrobe. They were soldiers, he said. How can you be so sure? I told you, they had expensive equipment. Enough is enough, his father said. What is that supposed to mean? His mother gave his father a look that made the back of Henry's neck chill, like a licked finger raised. Give the kid a break. His father reached for his wine and took several sips. I want to know what those men wanted, she said. They wanted to check our passports. Henry wondered if Dolores had let the terrier off the leash yet. Each night, Dolores untied Balaam, released him from the groundkeeper's quarters, and let Henry and his brother keep the dog overnight. Jason said they also wanted to know where we live. Their mother stopped smoothing the design of California poppies on her favorite denim skirt. When she placed her hands on her hips, the fire behind her picked up the light hairs along her forearms. You actually gave those soldiers our address? Mom, Henry said, the road we live on doesn't even have a name. This is our real address, his father said. He spread his arms to display his black t-shirt. Crumbs of banana nut bread littered a white silkscreen illustration of the Milky Way. An arrow pointed to one of the galaxy's spiral arms and indicated, you are here. Cut the act, Milton. His mother raised her voice and said, Mr. MacArthur Award-winning genius astronomer. She stalked in front of the fire in her bare feet, her breasts shaking, and looked down upon his father. The silverware in her fists bristled. Speared upon the tines of one fork, a morsel of meatloaf dropped onto the floor. Your t-shirt needs ironing, motherfucker. His father grinned downward and contemplated the wrinkled depiction of the Milky Way on the front of his t-shirt. The galaxy's spiral arms appeared to be rotating counterclockwise. These wrinkles merely represent the warped fabric of space-time. I thought you were like just some off-the-wall egghead too bohemian to properly dress yourself. To the contrary, his father said, I'm making a metaphysical fashion statement. The oak log caved in, showering sparks. Henry wanted to put the screen guard into place, but when he clutched his knees, his father shook his head. Henry marveled at the orange flames, their color ripening. Ashes drifted up the flue, like snowflakes in reverse. Are you crazy? His mother asked his father. Have you flipped out? Much madness is divinest sense. This was a desperate ordeal for our boys. I do believe that Henry relished his trip. His father shifted in his chair. Didn't you dig spending the night in our immaculate hotel, he said. Hacienda del Sol. Before Henry could respond, his mother said, enough with the jokes. Space-time isn't a joke. His father raised one finger. In point of fact, it is warped. You are what is warped. His mother backed closer to the fireplace, reaching behind her for support as she attempted to sit down. She said, fuck, fuck, fuck. Now you're waxing eloquent, his father said. Henry sent his mother a kind look. I can't do this. She wilted onto the hearth, sitting with her back to the fire, and dropped the silverware with a clatter that seemed to startle the shadows and make them jump. That's all right, his father said. The dishes can wait till morning. He pushed his frame up from his chair and staggered to the fireplace, where his crutches leaned against the chimney beside Henry's shoes and the folded screen guard. I never meant to drag you children into a war zone, his mother said. Spears of damp hair clung to her forehead, and her eyes were tinged with pink calligraphy. We'll have the Battle of Antietam right here in our living room if you try to make us leave early. His father shoved the poker at the fire and gored an ember. Think, he told her, it'll be a refreshing experience. Breezes came whiffling into the living room through the screen door. Unseen presences, they sweetened the smoky air and found their ways into dark nooks and hidden corners where the jittery shadows seemed to withdraw and whisper to each other. Henry sank back against the cushions and took a deep breath. His lungs had a surface area equivalent to a basketball court, according to his father. Traces of cannabis perfumed the air. He thought he could still feel what his father called cannabinoids dribbling through his veins. The scent of verbena and begonias circulated throughout the living room. Along the upper edges of the embers in the fireplace, sawtooth rows of flames capered. We have to leave, his mother said. I came here to research the Mayan long count calendar, his father said. No sense in turning tail after only 3 months. I believe there is sense in over one minor incident, his father said. That's galactically stupid. It may seem minor to you, but you weren't there. Neither were you. His father knocked the wrought iron stand as he leaned the poker beside the miniature broom and shovel. One hand on the mantle, he sent Henry a visual appeal. Did you ever feel that your safety was in jeopardy this morning? No, sir, Henry replied. From a corner of his vision, he saw his brother look away. That isn't the point, his mother said. What is the point, since you're such an authority? Regardless of what fawning drivel your loyal subject recites to placate you, his mother said, I absolutely refuse to jeopardize the welfare of our children just so you can enjoy an exotic locale in which to research your emotionally vacuous, vile little turd of a book. His father smiled. You're too kind. His mother seized the wine bottle. Henry thought she was going to throw it. He tensed his muscles, but all she did was peel one corner of the label with her polished thumbnail. In relief and weariness, he closed his eyes and listened to the clock ticking on the mantle. He was picturing its burr-shaped winding stem when he heard the bottle explode in the fireplace. He lunged back against the cushions. Shrill as flutes, the bamboo legs of the couch shrieked while skidding over the oak floorboards. The fireplace gargled and hissed, some flames turning the color of pumpkins. His mother's eyes flashed. What's the matter, man? His father sneered at her. The wine didn't suit your palate? A puddle swelled over the hearth. It did have a fruity bouquet, he said, with more than a hint of insolence. When his father told him to get a towel, Henry lurched onto his feet. His thoughts swam, and his injured ear ached. Jason stared. Henry passed the couch and exchanged looks with him that meant this was getting too heavy. A gust made the screen door creak inward. You're ripping us apart, his mother said, on the bloody altar of your academic ambition. Man, his father said, very eloquent. In the kitchen, Henry tore paper towels from the dispenser. As he returned to the living room, his fingers were quivering. Very eloquent indeed. Maybe you should scribble that down for posterity. Fuck you, Milton. You always were a romantic at heart, April. Do you take dictation? Will you ever stop? His mother sucked in a breath. Guess they should have given the violin award to you, doll face. Do not dare trivialize our son's achievement. She sent Jason a passionate, melting look. Jason sat frozen on the couch. You should be proud, she told his father. I am proud, his father said, but you don't have to mollycoddle the boy. Mollycoddle, his mother said. Mollycoddle. Henry soaked up the wine and stared at the coals. Embers the size of papayas seethed. When he leaned closer, he could hear a high-pitched undercurrent of sizzling. Rooted in sheer crescents, the flames shivered in the circulating drafts. He padded barefoot back toward the kitchen, still feeling a little stoned from the drugs, his hands full of wet bounty, the wine dripping on his feet. Breezes cooled his brow. He neared the screen door, glad to see Balaam nosing his way into the living room. But then he stopped. That snout did not belong to their dog. That animal was not a dog at all. Dad, he said. A long-whiskered otter wormed inside, reared up onto its hind legs, encased the living room with alert eyes and twitching nose. The otter's front paws dangled, as if the animal were fingering the brim of a hat. When the screen door swung shut, it bumped against the otter's tail. The otter dropped onto all fours and went toward the coffee table with a bounding motion. What on earth? His mother bolted onto her feet. His father said, Lutra canadensis. The otter loped along the floorboards. At the coffee table, the otter rose onto its hind legs and put its front paws on the edge next to a stack of his father's books. Maybe he's a cerebral otter, his father said. The otter sniffed the ashtray where a roach clip held a stubbed out joint of Acapulco gold. The otter's damp pelt looked dense and quilled, but Henry could still make out the ribcage. Maybe he's a party animal, his father said. He must be a cool otter. Maybe it's a she, Jason said. The otter ducked under the table, came out the other side, and gobbled up the morsel of meatloaf from the floor. His mother held still. The otter sniffed her toes before turning around. Henry pulled the door open and watched the otter leap down the steps onto the lawn, where it bounded across the terraces toward the lake. In the strip of light that came from the doorway, the otter paused beside an aloe vera plant and glanced back, its eyes glowing red. Waves lapped the shore. Henry stepped onto the walkway, feeling the limestone under his feet, and followed his mother and brother toward the shore. He passed islands of landscape boulders and flowers in the moonlight. His father hung out in the doorway, leaning on a crutch. At the dock, the odor of creosote irritated Henry's nostrils. The commotion of the otter drew his eyes to the cove. He passed his mother and brother, padding over the boards and trying to avoid splinters. At the deep end, he placed one hand upon a piling that jutted over his head. The otter swam around and around, making circles in the cove, leaping out of the water and belly flopping back down. She must have a den nearby, Jason said, with a litter of pups. She's a mother? Henry said. When the otter swam on her back, he saw 4 nipples, but they did not appear swollen. He wondered how long otter pups stayed with their mothers. Why else would she distract us, his mother said. She must have little ones. That's it.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was riveting. I was on the edge of my seat, especially as things came to a boiling point in the family, particularly between the parents, and then the otter comes in like this fantastical being almost, even though otters are real. There's kind of a, you know, a just us machina that seemed to come down and interrupt everything. But that was wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna just look at our Q&A. First, a question we have is from Sophia Samatar that is for Summer. And then I have another question to follow that up that is for both of you. So Summer, she says, it's so interesting that your narrator is a photographer. How has thinking about photography affected your writing?
I've spent a lot of time actually reading about different photographers and looking at different photography books. I feel that often I'm accessing a part of myself that's been suppressed a little bit in adulthood, which is a more visual side. So the research is supplemental, but it doesn't feel completely separate from who I am. I think that part of me is always there. So yeah, in some ways, these two characters, I think, are both of me, kind of the two sides of me sparring with each other at times, disagreeing about how the world can be understood.
So I have a question for both of you, and it's one that was actually submitted to me via email. And it is from Jillian Lynch. She asked of both of you, what book has most influenced you? And Thomas, you can answer first if you like. Unless you want time to think.
Well, it's hard to boil influence down to just a single book. One of the people with whom I've had, who's had a deep influence on me recently, there are actually two writers, both John Updike and William Styron, because I think of them as literary stylists. Updike was just a prodigy, pouring out book after book after book for 7 decades. Well, 5 decades, I guess. And Styron, I have a special affection for because, as I understand it, he was a tortured perfectionist who had this need to carve out these tightly honed nuggets, paragraph by paragraph. And so I think he only ended up publishing 4 novels over his lifetime, but they were hard-won books. And so those are 2 examples of writers that appeal to me very much because of the way that they write.
Thank you, Tom. Summer?
Yeah, it is a hard question to answer. The book that I reread most often is James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room. I always take it with me when I go to a writing residency or retreat and start the retreat by reading it. So I think it would qualify as a pretty influential book. Also, Deborah, I've learned so much from obviously so many writers, but Deborah Eisenberg also comes to mind, and some of her stories have taught me a lot about sort of what I want to do with storytelling. There's one in particular all around Atlantis, which got me thinking about ways I could tell the novel that I was just reading from.
Thank you, Summer. I'm seeing in the chat too from Sophia. I think it's Sophia Samatar loved Giovanni's Room, and actually that book by Baldwin seems to be in the atmosphere because I've had a few students talk about it this week too. So.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Well, I'm always telling them to read it, so maybe, I don't know. I wonder if they got the tip from me.
It may be so. It's a beautiful book. So this one is for both of you too, and it's from Jake Girl. how do you decide how much of your personal life and experiences to put into your work? Is it merely a changing of names and minor details, or something else?
Do you want to take it, Tom?
No, you go ahead, Summer. I'll follow.
Well, yeah, I mean, this project that I just read from is pretty different for me because it does draw from my own experience more. I mean, I'm first generation Lebanese American. There are similarities. I grew up in New Jersey. So it is really my first kind of concerted, deliberate attempt to write about being an immigrant and growing up in an immigrant family. And it just took me so long, and it's continuing to take time to sort through all of that. I'm trying to say that because it's more personal, that's made it in a lot of ways more challenging for me. That space between, where the line is, it's hard. It's not easy to let go of the facts of your own life, to let the story expand. And again, it's just taken me time to do that and to sort of let go of my own personal experience enough to allow Mina Bitar to become her own person. Yeah.
Erica, would you mind if I ask Summer a question?
No, please do. Yeah.
I liked it that you use Arabic in your writing. And I think of the inclusion of foreign languages as a benefit, both aesthetically, sort of like having something in the stew, another ingredient that
Mhm.
swaps with the ones that are there, and then also politically. And I wondered if you would mind talking a little bit about the creative opportunities that stem from your inclusion of Arabic.
I use it a little reluctantly, honestly. Yeah, it does appear in the beginning of the book like that. This character, Mina, she's very conflicted about her identity as Lebanese. She grew up in an arch assimilationist kind of household, a household that didn't really embrace being Lebanese very explicitly. And so for me, when kind of typical cultural markers like language or food come up in this book, there's always a kind of tension there for her with identifying with these markers, I guess, with these different signs of her Lebanese-ness.
Yeah, it seems to me like the inclusion of language from another culture is a way of, I don't know, there's a kind of validation in that. It's a way of recognizing the humanity of someone else. So I like it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, your dialogue was very much stood out to me too, and was just very kind of colorful and exciting to follow and listen to. So it's interesting that you would be paying attention to that as well.
Well, there was Spanish in that third chapter. I had to cut out about 50% in order to. That's from the third chapter of my first novel, and what I read is about half as long as the chapter actually is. Mm-hmm. And so I cut out a lot, and a lot of what I cut out was in Spanish.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, just snippets.
Yeah.
That I try to couch in a context so that someone who doesn't know Spanish can make an educated guess about what it means.
I do worry about it feeling like an accessory. I always want to, I worry about that. That always gives me pause, I think. I think that's what I meant when I said reluctant too. Yeah.
Well, Summer, it sounds like from what you said before, in answer to Jake's question about knowing that some of the experiences you're writing about speak to you, they are familiar to you based on some of your own experiences, but you have to let them go enough to let your main character, Mina, be her own And similarly, it sounds to me like wanting to make sure that the language is well integrated and natural is a similar impulse rather than an accessory, as you're saying.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
Tom, do you wanna answer Jake's question, or does it feel like a private question?
Oh, I'm sorry if I neglected you, Jake. My mind was running on a different line. I find it difficult not to be autobiographical in some meaningful sense of that admittedly nebulous word. And so what I typically find myself doing is looking for rhetorical strategies to objectify my protagonist. And partly for that reason, what I do is I write in the third person almost all the time, so that I can think of that character as someone other than myself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just working with what little I have, with my sort of internal sensibility, and trying to make the best of it. And since I naturally gravitate toward autobiographical work, that's what I do. Now, I know that someone like John Irving, based on what he says in his novels, would probably disapprove of that approach, but it's what I have. I have to work with what I have. I have to be true to myself. A lot of writers are highly imaginative in a way that does not seem autobiographical. I'm just not one of those. So
Well,
I don't know. Maybe that addresses your question, Jake.
Yeah, I mean, Tom, I couldn't tell. I mean, I know that your the bio you gave me says that you grew up in part in Central America. So obviously,
Oh, that scene actually happened, and Otter really did come in. I really did live down there. Now, the parts about drugs, I had to do research, but everything else was close to my life. And there really was an otter who really did come in and was apparently drawn by the smell of food. And we made the conclusion in retrospect that that was a mother who, needed sustenance. It really happened.
Wow.
it's amazing. I mean, and other attendees in the chat are like, wow, the otter. And for me too, I just thought, well, I guess it's partly one of those truth is stranger than fiction things. Like here you're writing fiction, or at least that's what it's being labeled, but you say it's autobiographical and true. I mean, of course, an otter comes into your life when you least expect it.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful scene. I love how atmospheric your work is. I really felt so put into a world, just in terms of the light and the smells, even of the cannabis, like everything puts us into a world. Sophia Scimitar had asked of you, Tom, in the QA, where did this fascinating story come from? But I think we've maybe answered that, but do you want to say anything else about what it came out of? Or if you do feel that you've answered that, then I do have a question about what is it about your sensibility that focuses so much on or draws you to the setting, the atmosphere? What about having such a vivid setting are you drawn to?
I don't know. It's naturally what I gravitate toward when I start writing. And so one of the pitfalls, one of my many weaknesses is I tend to include too many details about the setting and too much sensory information. It just seems natural to me, and I like it. And so I have to go in there and prune and prune and prune and take things out. I don't know why I do that, but it's just my natural inclination.
Yeah, I think that's just good for other writers to know that there are others out there who sort of spend it all on the page, and then you have to pare back. Samar, I have a slightly different question for you. I've read a bunch of your work, and I've read earlier drafts of this work, and I find a lot of your work, even though it's not necessarily always first person, to be really voice and character driven. Is it just a coincidence that the pieces I've read are very character driven, or would you say that when you're starting out, you're drawn to a character or a voice in your head, and then you go with that? I mean, how do these stories begin? How do you get inspired?
Yeah, this story for me to write in first person is very uncomfortable. I typically write in third. And so I really agree with what Tom said. I am I'm not an incredibly inventive writer. I think that's the right word. I'm not so inventive. And one tool I use to separate myself from the characters that I'm creating is the third person. I also like the third person, to circle back to Sophia's question earlier about photography. I find it more visual, more of like a kind of you're staring, it's more voyeuristic in a sense. And the first person is so performative and so much about voice, as you're saying, and that's actually not comfortable for me. Maybe it's why this book is taking so long, but I have to work harder, I think, than other writers to get that voice that I want. It was a struggle. I'm going to say there were 2 or 3 years of just working on the voice of this character, Mina. Yeah. So, but I don't know if I answered your question.
No, I actually think it's so wonderful to just be honest about your processes.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful thing. And you've both been so generous in your honesty and also in your writing. Your writing is just so rich, and I can't wait to hear more. Thank you so much for reading for us tonight. We've reached our time. Thank you so much to everyone out there who has joined us tonight and listened to these two gorgeous writers. And we hope to see you again soon. Take care of yourselves, and good night.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica, and
Thank
everyone.
you.